I can't hide behind data or jargon, because see, people get through that now. And people can figure out how to game the process. And if I have a kind of a plan that hasn't really been and it's hard for that, part of the problem of kind of not having the right structures in place is that there's not enough awareness of various kinds of decisions or plans being made. So then all of a sudden, all this work has been done by the city or the schools or whatever, and they think that kind of that all they're looking for is a final approval from the community, and then all of a sudden, at the last minute, people come out of the woodwork and say, forget it, this is not what we want. I mean, you see that repeated over and over again. So I think people are learning the hard way, and often it's a kind of a very scarring experience for them as local leaders of various kinds, that the design ain't working, and so that's what's propelling a lot of this experimentation and some new kinds of engagement.
Yeah, well, what do you do when you get in a situation where they call for trust and you're told one thing and you run with that, and then you find out later that, that wasn't a story, it was something different?
Well, the kind of the information is not.
Yeah, like say you're looking for a situation to develop, and you're told that it can't happen that way because of certain factors, and then down the road you find out that wasn't true at all.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Let's be more specific out there. That's what it was.
We need some context here.
Do you want me to, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like we were told that Central Howard wasn't able to be used as a site for the Booklet students to go to during the Reconstruction. Now we find out there's a program being run out of there now that's holding about 300 kids.
Right. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I don't know about anything about this particular situation, but clearly, yes, any kind of thing. That's right. Exactly. Yeah, and that's it's not the kind of thing one has to kind of. It's hard to repair after the fact. Go ahead.
Okay. The quality of life has gone down, and it seems to me that the major reason, at least up until this recession, was that every adult in the family is working, and they have to work.
Yeah.
So I think that is a major change.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. It's hard to have time for all kinds of things when you're working all day and you've got kids to take care of at night and all that kind of stuff. So driven by all these kinds of situations and others, we got this kind of growth of this kind of engagement work on all different kinds of issues: school issues, local budget issues, zoning and land use questions, race and diversity issues, youth, neighborhood. There's probably 12 others I could name. The kind of explosion of this kind of stuff. And so a fair amount of lessons learned there about how to do it well, and also what the weaknesses are, limitations of this kind of stuff. I had this meeting earlier this year where I invited a bunch of people who are good, who are kind of versed at engagement in one area or another, to kind of come together, compare notes, what they did well, what they thought the strengths of their work, and also the limitations of their work. And so I ended up, and I asked them all to kind of give me a slide on your area. So, and I'm just going to zip through these, and you can actually scrutinize these if you want. I'll send the slides, but I'm just going to zip through and just say, with education, with land use and planning issues, with immigrant integration kinds of work, budgeting work, race and diversity and equity work, that basically you got kind of the same set of things that are emerging as successful practices. And so I'll run through them. First thing is numbers matter. Having large, diverse, critical masses of people involved has a huge amount of power to it. It has power in all kinds of ways, because of the problem-solving capacity of those people, because of their ability to pressure their elected officials and other kinds of decision makers, and also just to give a sense of kind of the community coming together around a particular issue or question. And so what seems to work to kind of produce those kinds of large, diverse, critical masses is to go beyond the kind of old traditional practice of let's call the meeting and hope people show up and put the article in the paper and all that kind of thing. People realize now in order to do that well, you have to actually map your community, figure out what do people belong to, where do they congregate, what churches are they part of, what workplaces, where do they work, what other clubs, organizations, schools, universities, what is it that they are belong to? And then how can I kind of reach into those different kinds of groupings of people and get people in those settings to kind of recruit people to come out for this project, for this meeting, whatever it is I'm trying to organize. So people are going to come to something because they're asked by somebody they already know and respect. And so being able to kind of build that web of relationships and to be strategic about it so that you can figure out how can I bring in parts of the community that aren't typically represented, and who do I know in those networks, in those organizations that kind of get me people who I suspect are going to be less likely to come. That works across all these different kinds of issue areas. The other thing that's important is kind of the size of the group, and recognizing that if you want people to have some kind of dialogue, if you want them to learn about public issue, if you want them to kind of look at a bunch of different options about what ought to be done, if you want them to do action planning, all that can be done in a group of no more than about 10 or 12. Those are small group tasks for which you need small groups. And then other things are large group goals. If you want to inspire people, if you want to give people kind of basic baseline of information so everyone's on the same page, all that kind of stuff, large groups. So recognizing what size of the group you need for what you're trying to do is important. And then in whether it's large or small groups, kind of recognizing that the process always matters a lot. And there's some really kind of tested, proven over and over again group process techniques that will work. So for example, having a facilitator who is there not to give their opinions, but to make sure everyone else has a chance to speak, to help the group manage the time it has, use the materials it has, to deal with conflict that may emerge, all those kinds of things. Someone who can really be a servant to the process. And it doesn't have to be somebody who's paid money. It doesn't have to be a professional. If you can get those kinds of people, that's great. But most of these kinds of engagement efforts, these end up being volunteers who get some training and who kind of muddle through. And in general, if they can obey that kind of one thing of not bringing in their own opinions and ideas, they almost always do great and the groups go well. And if they don't, they don't. Other pieces that's important, that's a good process thing, is having some kind of guide, agenda, or a discussion guide which really lays out some of the information, some of the kind of discussion questions for the group to use, different viewpoints about what ought to be done, different action ideas, all those kinds of things. Having that is important. And also giving people a chance at the beginning to talk about their experience and relate whatever story they have to tell with why they care about the issue. Giving people that chance to kind of talk on that level. Why do you care about this? How long have you lived here? What was school like for you when you were a kid? All those kinds of questions can really help people kind of explain to each other why they care and kind of build some empathy, rebuild some of the trust. It also is helpful as far as kind of equalizing the playing field a little bit between the city council member and the person who's never come to some meeting like this ever before in their lives, because it's a question everybody can answer. And so that's a really important piece to start with. And then another important piece that is difficult is recognizing that this doesn't work if all you're trying to do is just kind of advertise the solution that you think is best. That you've got to be able to put on the table several different options about what ought to be done about this particular issue or decision, and kind of let people talk about it and kind of figure out for themselves what they think. And that's obviously very difficult, because if you care about the issue enough to have kind of organized or set up these meetings or whatever, then clearly you know what you think is the right thing to do. And you may be completely convinced that option C is the only way to move forward. And yet what you've got to do is take that leap of faith that a kind of a diverse set of people with goodwill and good process are actually going to be able to kind of talk to each other about something and decide for themselves and come up with something that may not be too bad. Or it may in fact be quite like what you already think. Or that part of it is also kind of not only giving them A, B, or C, but also saying to them, is there a combination of A and B that you like best, or is there a D that nobody's thought of before, all those kinds of things. Another emerging practice that seems to be successful is giving people a chance and giving people the expectation, in fact, that action is going to happen at a bunch of different levels. And that, in fact, their job is not just to recommend what the school board ought to do or the city council or whoever. That's part of what they should be doing, but they also should be figuring out what are they going to do as volunteers, as members of small groups or task forces or committees, as members of organizations and other kind of groups in the community, thinking about action in all those different kinds of levels and thinking about it in terms of being part of their own responsibility not simply to kind of making their suggestions to some other person to implement, but to actually figure out where they kind of fit in that picture. And then a final thing that's emerging, and as you can imagine, it's kind of emerging really fast now and kind of changing as we speak, is kind of the use of online communication, social media, alongside some of this face-to-face stuff to kind of create a more enriching and powerful kind of atmosphere. And I think part of what we know now, at least so far about that, is that online communication is not going to replace face-to-face stuff, or vice versa. That basically online and face-to-face have their own unique strengths and weaknesses, and so what you got to do is create some kind of a setup or a structure where you've got both going on. Because there's nothing to replace the power of that kind of face-to-face, personal connection and talking about some of these kinds of things. And yet there's also nothing to replace the ability to be part of some of this kind of stuff at 11 o'clock in your pajamas, and on your own time. And lots of communities are kind of just starting to kind of figure out and experiment with how do we kind of weave together these things so that they really kind of complement one another. Okay, so all those words mashed down to a few smaller ones. Diverse critical mass, structured engagement's important, deliberative, which that's the kind of the giving people a chance to kind of decide what they think among a bunch of different options, being action oriented, and combining the online stuff and the face-to-face. Okay, so when I went through this exercise with the people kind of who are experts in all these different issue areas, and I think I've covered some of this already, but basically, whether you're talking about engagement in education or in budgeting or land use or whatever, or crime or race, that basically people were doing it for fairly similar reasons. They wanted to kind of, they knew they had kind of big controversial kinds of questions or decisions that the community had to make, and so they wanted to kind of do that in a reasonable way. They got more people kind of talking about it and working on it. They wanted to rebuild trust in the process. And when it was done well, and it wasn't always done well, but when it was done well and met those three goals above, and also, in fact, in many cases, what these kinds of things did was give new leaders a chance to kind of step forward and kind of find their voice, find some allies, and kind of take a next step. The challenges, though, across the board were quite similar. One is that it takes a lot of time to do good engagement work. That the recruitment is, in fact, as you can imagine, and I know a lot of you have probably lived this, but the recruitment is the most time-consuming thing, reaching out and figuring out kind of those networks, forming those kinds of relationships. That these things are hard to sustain, and in fact, in many cases, or most cases, they're not even designed to be sustained because they're so issue-focused or decision-focused. It's how do we help the community come up with a new master plan, or how do we help the community balance the budget? And so it's not intended to be something that is going to go on into the future. It may meet the goals of the engagers, the people who kind of started out kind of organizing the process, whether they're people working in City Hall or whether they're community organizers or whoever, but it didn't necessarily kind of meet the goals of the engaged or the involved. And in any case, it usually was no kind of discussion up front about expectations or why might we all be part of this process. And that in general, that, even in a situation where you have a really successful project that got a whole bunch of people involved, had all kinds of outcomes and tangible outcomes, you could still go back to that community a year later or 2 years later, and the fundamental relationship between the people who lived there and the institutions designed to serve them was not changed. Okay, so I think that's part of the frustration and the limitation of this kind of engagement work. We know a lot about how to do it kind of temporarily and to have some good outcomes, but we don't have the we haven't been able to embed it in ways that kind of really kind of sustain that engagement over time. And that's part of, and I'll talk more about this, but that's part of what's exciting about concepts like the community learning centers, because part of that whole idea is to set up that kind of vital space inside schools that kind of sustain that level of energy and participation.